you for this opportunity. I was given quite a daunting task. I was like, hey, why about talking about new media landscape and how they might affect scientific information seeking and science attitude. Quite a task, quite a number of studies I could be referring to for this talk today. So I have chosen to actually focus on specific aspects. First of all, talking about how science communication, as we have known it, is been evolving because we haven't actually addressed that too much today. And how that is related to the new environment for news media as a whole and for the information consumer as a whole beyond science communication exercises. And this will relate to specifically addresses where do people find information where they are looking for science information and what do they do with it. And finally, trying to attempt to address some of the daunting questions we have right now and that a lot of people have talked to me over break, but what do they do with this information? Who do they trust? How does that may impact their attitude? So very briefly, what do we mean when we say that traditional views of science communication are redefined? Well, the first thing that comes to mind is actually supported by research by the Pew Research Center that shows that the most likely activity that people engage when they go online is actually going to search. And actually, one number of people have said, Matt here, why don't you Google my report to find out what I've said? And indeed, that's what people may do the most, and we are, in the process of researching this type of information environment. If I attempted to type a science on my Google search, you can see that after 0.14 seconds, I wasn't even able to finish typing the word. I had more than 2 billion answers that were offered to me, with actually quite puzzling science fair project, science definition, scientific calculator coming up. Knowing that I have a 16-year-old boy that actually doesn't like to use a scientific calculator, but likes to use a computer, I assume that's why that come up as the third choice here. But that shows you that already that first step, that searching process that actually is likely to be engaged by a lot of audience is something we need to take into account. Second of all, blogs. We talked a lot about blogs. We talked a lot about news, but what makes news, what makes blogs? Here I give you an example of science blogs, which is actually a conglomerate of blogs addressing science. More than 80 bloggers that are chosen for their creativity, for their approaches to science, for their likelihood to cover interesting topics. We may not fit actually what traditional science communication would see as the best topics, but may actually fit what the audience are looking for. And I'm not expecting you to read this either, but you can see on the list here the quite array of potential topics that are covered from those blogs. I'll talk about blogs more in a few minutes. Third, YouTube and any type of social media environment where you can share, you can comment, and YouTube and other type of video sharing context allow you to actually share things that to some extent combine some of the dimensions that Chip had talked about, that whole audio, potential, video, image, with also writing tools that are provided by the Commons capacities in this environment. And why did I choose this specific example here? Because this is actually a very interesting scientific topic. We have a team of engineers here at the Grass Lab at the University of Pennsylvania that developed a swarm of nano quadrotors. For somebody like me that actually studies nanotechnology, I was pleasantly surprised to see that this has generated more than 6 million views since January. This is actually pure science communication directly from scientists in the lab putting out there something that's actually very fun to watch. So I won't spoil it for you. Google it and you'll be able to watch it. So number one, searching. Google built the most used browser. Number two, blogs, whatever that means, and I'll talk about that. Number two, video sharing, among other type of capabilities of sharing information. And you see I haven't mentioned Wikipedia, Twitter, etc. Hopefully, science of science communication number two let me elaborate on all those for which we have actually strong empirical evidence as how they might, impact a public conversation about scientific topics. So today I will focus more specifically on blogs, and searching, But just a note on this exercise here about my little nano quadrators. These were posted, as I said, directly by scientists from the lab. And I think that's something we need to keep in mind too as we talk about direct science communication being an evolving environment, that direct communication from the scientists to potential audiences is something that we see actually particularly endorsed by younger scientists. And here I have stolen some of the day of my colleague, Dietram Schäufler here. I think he presented other aspects of this empirical research in his opening talk. But here I just wanted to point out that quantitative analysis that had to predict how people are likely to post their findings directly online or elsewhere for the public to be informed, it's much more prominent among young scientists. So a new generation of scientists that are actually endorsing that direct communication exercise for the good or the bad. Obviously, I think for the good, but obviously that's changing the way we think of science communication in these new environments. Last but not least, another aspect that to some extent hasn't been talked about, because what I should say actually, I should have said as a starting point for my talk, is the processes that Matt and Chip have outlined in their two talks previously are still valid in obviously the online environment. The process of selective exposure, for example. I'm going to go look for a blog that actually will be in line with whatever I think is the right way to think. I will actually, look at YouTube and search for something that's interesting to me. However, I may also go somewhere because people have sent it to me. That notion of viral information, and this is the buzzword in marketing. How can we get something to get viral? If it only gets viral, then people will be interested to it. And that Cognitus 12, for example, it's an excellent example of this type of process where a very successful viral exercise to some extent to actually send around a persuasive message about a specific topic. The good news is that science can go viral. According to this research here from the University of Pennsylvania, the researchers looked at the likelihood of a story making the list of the most emailed and going viral. And you can see here that one of the dimensions that going to increase the likelihood of a story going viral is something that's awe-inspiring. And I hope that we all agree here that science would fit in this category. Those stories that's like, wow, the wow story. The one that's going to be like, Jesus, this is really interesting to me. I'm going to send it to my friend. I may post it on my Facebook. I may tweet about it if wireless allows me to do so. So in evolving science communication environment, now we see a lot of potential topics to tackle in this talk, and I cannot address all of those. My research group at UW-Madison is actually tackling with Dietram Schäufler some of the conversation going on Twitter, for example, based on extensive algorithm that mine the conversation, try to see how the information is disseminated, but I won't be able to talk about that today. But I want to step back a little bit and say, but what's happening? Are people going online? Because Chip actually left us with the Virginia picture that seemed to be indicating that a lot of people are not. But what's going on? And again, referring to Pew Internet America Live survey here, 4 to 5 Americans, 4 in 5 Americans use regularly the internet. I'm sure you're not surprised about that. But however, I think that we need to keep in mind, and that goes back to my point about searches, is that the most popular online activity in 2012 was using search engines. That's what people do. They actually go. So if we actually want to get, some, like likelihood to have our information found, we actually need to be able to make people find it with any tool we have, such as keyword optimization, such as likelihood of the website to come to the top of the list, because people are indeed engaging in those activities. And here, as far as more precise, and I'm not asking you to look at all those numbers, just look at the 4 first row here. On a typical day, the search engine process is indeed here. Send already email, we're not surprised. But the third, and that's actually something we need to keep in mind, 40% of people that are online and every typical day go to a social networking site. So social networks are not actually an activity that stays around teenagers that want to correspond with their friends. This is actually something that people do on a regular basis, and this is something as science communication researchers we have been interested in finding out. I was surprised that actually checking the weather came so late, because that's what I do every day in Wisconsin. Another point that I want to you guys to keep in mind too, sorry for being so informal here, the potential of online sharing with video sharing is also something that's not left to the teenage world. 71% of online adults use video sharing sites such as YouTube, which also, as far as science communication context, has a lot of potential implication. And we have research right now that looks at how YouTube environment may impact people's attitudes toward global warming and public engagement about the issue. Last but not least, the mobility of the way we can actually carry devices around to find out. And why do we care about that? Because actually 60% of adults go online wirelessly on those devices. And actually that's good news for us. They may actually hear something and Google it. They may actually see a sign and look for it on their wireless. And as a matter of fact, the devices such as those have increased the likelihood of people to reading the news. So it's actually good news for the news. The mobile devices had actually improved a little bit people's tendency to read the news. So I think we need to actually be honest about this. Traditional media have been replaced by online social media as potential news sources. Some of you may be aware of this Facebook page that's designed specifically for journalists. Basically, Facebook offering journalists ways to reach their audiences, giving them tools to actually be able to reach their audience through Facebook. And keeping in mind that when you look at the aggregate number of active users for Facebook in the US, 126 million, compared to the 10th largest newspaper circulation, 8 million, the fantastic opportunity that resides as far as social networking potential for reaching, convincing, changing, informing, understanding different topics is absolutely fabulous. And I think as a sign of these times, we need to remember that the recent Pulitzer Prize went actually to two of primary online news outlets, the Huffington Post and Politico, with the New York Times set in the sign of the changing media landscape. So we do need to pay attention to those news sources. And as I was telling you, those social networks contribute to the diffusion of news. And we have some research that actually did say that not only people will access the news from their mobile device, but they will access news because they saw a link on a social network page. So I go, one of my favorite, two of my favorite news providers on Facebook being on this panel today, pointed out actually some items of interest, posting them on their Facebook, increasing the likelihood for myself of clicking and going is actually extremely powerful. And you can here see that 60% of internet users that use a social networking site had actually accessed the news from there. In some new communication environments, and not only as they relate to science, provide essentially limited information. Large number of issues can be obtained anywhere without relatively little effort. But more importantly, this information out there provides the opportunity for users in a Web 2.0 environment to connect with others, to share ideas, to comment on those items, and that's what I'm going to be focusing about in a few minutes. So what with science then? They can access everywhere. They can go and find whatever information. I can access whatever I want. I select whatever I want. I use my value predispositions, my perceptual filters to make sense of that information in a way that completely actually is in line with what Chip was saying. So we have a good understanding as researchers in science communication based on good solid empirical evidence of how people make sense of certain type of information. But where do they get it? So research that we have collected, data that we have collected in 2010 showed us that there is actually a shift for cohort among audiences for science news. So you can see in this graph here, in this line here, how people would actually access information about science. And the way we did this research is we asked them, where do you pay the most attention to science news? We're not very surprised as far as overall the American population. We see what we knew, that the traditional media outlets actually to some extent are still, you know, where they pay attention. And television has always been the main source of scientific information for you know, several decades in the United States. And we could see here, newspapers, 16% of population. Important. Newspaper, we mean online or print newspaper. We don't do this distinction anymore in media studies. It's either, you know, like the media, the print edition or the online edition. Here, online and traditional media mix means people that go to blogs, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, etc. And those traditional media, television, either also online or print, and online only, which are the blogs, the social networks, etc., etc. So 7% of the population actually rely only on that stuff that we are beginning to understand. However, if you look at the younger crowd here, you can see that definitely there's a shift toward the online only. The 18 to 34-year-old here, almost 40% of them doesn't even go to an online version of the newspaper or like a, you know, online version of CNN. They go to other things. So if we want to reach those, this is through a social networking side. This is the video sharing side. And not surprising though, as you look at the different cohorts for different ages here, you can see more particularly the 55 and older that realize obviously very much less on the online only and much more on the traditional media mix. So we do have that shift online to those other forms of online communication, but for those, but now those shifts are not across the board. We can see that actually for those that go online, mainly males tend to do so compared to females. So to some extent, when we talk about those potential gaps that Chip was alluding to, there's something that will be going on online too, particularly as education level also seem to indicate where will people get their information. In this case, we do have, so the more male educated type of audience are the ones that are going to go to those specific online sources I was telling you about that don't fall within the traditional criteria of traditional media. So we call that a new active online science audience online to some extent, and the recent National Science Board data and the Science Engineering Indicators 2012, based on 2010, you may know that they actually conduct research every 2 years to track patterns related to scientific information and science engineering as a whole. They did show here that almost 60% of the audience here relies on online information when they are looking at specific science issues. For current news, and that's the first line here, they still rely on traditional media. For specific scientific issue, online, and among those 40% are the ones that go for blogs, etc. So basically, this is to convince you that the type of research my group does is extremely important. We do focus on the online environment and rely on sophisticated research methodologies to try to understand how those new media environments may impact people's attitudes, interests, and other type of dependent variable online. So the first, I'm going to allude to just 2 studies, and the first one relates to what I was telling you about searching. So if search is really what people do, how does that may affect them to some extent, but what are they likely to find? So what we've done is like trying to understand the relationship with searching patterns and the type of content people are likely to find. And we did that in the context of the National Science NSEC Center, an NSF Center at UW, where we actually program a software to try to understand how the content is present in those online environments. Daunting task when you see actually the amount of information that you have to gather. And we match that with actually data from Nielsen Online that tell us what actually people look for. We have data about keyword searches. We can understand what people are looking for. What we find, disturbingly, is that there's a discrepancy between what people are actually looking online, and as I was telling you, based on keyword searches from Nielsen Online, what items are suggested to them. And I told you that I was really not interested in finding scientific calculators on my search for science as a term, but so the type of things that Google might offer to them as suggestions, like for example here with biotech, is clearly something that's focusing on economy that's suggested to people. And what they find as content analysis, what we found for nanotech is that independently of the type of search they've done, nano and the environment, nano economy, etc., the vast majority of the content they were likely to find in the first pages were related to health. So there's to some extent the potential for audiences to get a distorted view of the reality of a scientific environment, and what we call, to some extent, the potential of a self-reinforced information spiral. The Google suggested, to some extent, are going to drive the searches. I see the Google, I'm going to click on that, I'm going to go there. The searches are going to increase that traffic. That traffic is going to increase the page ranks. It's going to likely impact what I'm going to click into. Our opinion formed based on what Google presents, rather than what individuals are searching. This is actually an important thing that we are looking at in more detail right now. By the way, some of those ideas were presented in the filter bubble. I don't know if you read that book by Eli Pariser that was actually raising the issue related to filtering and how the algorithms that are related to searches. But empirically, we have actually confirmed that this is something that's happening when in the online environment. Information is contextualized. What I mean by that is that information that actually we look in online, and this is something that actually I want to leave you with, is what Chip was telling you about media effects that we know is to some extent what that information is packaged in something that we know. We know how television presents entertainment. We know, as media researchers, we know, we understand print, we understand newspaper writing, etc. What happens when those contexts are contextualized by user comments, by Facebook likes, by mention machines? I couldn't find a mention machine for a scientific topic, I apologize, which means basically how many tweets have been said on a specific topic on a specific day. How will that actually impact consumer views? So I'm going to leave today with just a brief summary of a study we've done with a random sample of the American population in extremely sophisticated experimental design that looked at the comments on blogs and how that might impact credibility of what people think about the opinion that's expressed in this post. And what we've done with this, we manipulated the civility, the nature of the comment as far as how rude they were or not. And leaving content, here, the post itself, constant, written by a science writer and about the risk and benefits of two potential technology, what we find is online civility increases the perception of bias in the story. So the best we do, the best we try to write stories that are objective and stuff, the fact that the comments are likely to contextualize this story has extremely important consequences. So I leave you with this, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. The only thing that I want to end up with is science community's recent findings in this area particularly need to be taken into account with all the adds-on of my colleagues here, because the work is in progress. Thank you.